This is my true story. Christmas used to be the happiest day of my life, the day my 9 sons would come home, eat, laugh, and fill the house with joy. But last year, things changed. They came only to take photos, eat my food, and leave for their parties. That night, I sat alone beside the tree, the lights flickering over untouched gifts. The house was silent, my heart heavier than ever. But by morning, everything changed. Their bank accounts were empty and their houses were no longer theirs. Before I tell you how, tell me where you're watching from. And please subscribe so my story reaches more people. Christmas had always meant family to me. It wasn't about the gifts, the lights, or the noise. It was about warmth, the kind that only comes from being surrounded by the people you once carried in your arms. For weeks before the holiday, I moved slowly but with purpose, preparing for what I thought would be another year of togetherness. My body may have grown old, but my heart still beat with the rhythm of motherhood, steady, hopeful, forgiving. Every morning I polished the old wooden table that had seen decades of laughter. It was the same table where my 9 sons once sat fighting over who got the biggest piece of cake, the same table where my late husband carved the roast every Christmas Eve. I laid out the tablecloth he had bought me when we were young, a faded red one with gold embroidery, because some memories never fade, no matter how much time tries to blur them. I spent my mornings planning the menu, cooking the dishes they loved most. One wanted roast chicken, another wanted pudding, and another always asked for my special soup. Even though I knew they wouldn't eat much, I made everything, not because they asked, but because a mother's love doesn't need a reason. Every dish carried a memory. Every spice I added felt like love stitched into flavor. My hands shook while cooking, but I didn't stop. The thought of all of them sitting together again gave me the strength my body lacked. I went to the attic and pulled out old decorations that had gathered dust for years. The ornaments my husband had made by hand, the paper stars the boys had cut out as children, the tiny angel figurine that always sat on top of the tree, I placed them one by one with care. When I stepped back, the tree shimmered softly, the lights glowing like gentle reminders of the past. I smiled, thinking maybe this year would bring us closer again. Maybe this year they'd stay longer. Maybe this year they'd see me not as an obligation, but as home. The night before Christmas, I could hardly sleep. My heart beat faster with excitement. I imagined their cars pulling up, their footsteps echoing in the hall, their laughter spilling into every room. I pictured hugs, chatter, maybe even tears of joy. I had cleaned every corner of the house, not because I cared what they thought, but because I wanted them to see the home as it once was, the one filled with care and pride. That morning, I woke before dawn. The sky outside was still dark, a faint trace of snow falling like feathers. I lit a small candle by the window, a habit I had kept for years. It was something my husband used to do. He'd say, a light in the window means someone's waiting. I smiled, whispering to him in my mind that the boys were coming today. He would have been proud, I thought. Proud to see the family together, proud that our children had made lives of their own. I wore my best dress, the simple green one that he always said made my eyes look kind. I brushed my hair slowly and put on the pearl necklace he had given me on our last Christmas together. My reflection in the mirror looked older, but my heart felt young again. I was ready for them, my 9 sons, the 9 pieces of my heart, walking around in the world. By afternoon, the house began to fill with the smell of food, warmth, and memory. I placed candles on the table, set out the plates that once belonged to my mother, and looked at each chair, imagining their faces filling the empty spaces. For a moment, the silence before their arrival felt almost holy, like the air itself was waiting for love to enter. I thought about the first Christmas after my husband's passing. It had been painful, empty, too quiet. But even then, my sons had shown up, a little late, a little distracted, but they came. They promised they always would. That promise had been my comfort for years. And now, even if they had changed, even if they were busier, I believed somewhere in their hearts they still cared. Mothers always believe, even when logic tells them not to. Love whispers. Maybe this time will be different. I arranged small gift boxes for each of them. Nothing grand, just tokens of love. A sweater I had knitted, an old photo framed, a keepsake from their childhood. It wasn't the value that mattered, it was the memory. Each box held a piece of me, wrapped in quiet affection. As the clock neared evening, I felt a flutter in my chest, the sound of a car outside, then another, then another. My heart leapt. They were here. I straightened the plates one last time, fixed the candles, and whispered a small prayer. "Thank you," I said softly to no one in particular, perhaps to my husband, perhaps to fate. When the first door opened and laughter spilled in, my chest warmed. Their voices, deep and grown, filled the space I had missed for so long. Even though time had changed them, older faces, tired eyes, colder tones, to me they were still my boys. My heart swelled just seeing them under my roof again. They hugged me, quickly, like people in a hurry. Their arms didn't linger, but I didn't mind. I chose to see the good, that they were here at all. I noticed they brought gifts for each other, big, shiny boxes wrapped in bright paper, but not a single one for me. Still, I smiled. A mother doesn't count gifts. She counts presents. I told them the food was ready. They nodded, barely listening, chatting among themselves about work, holidays, new cars, and plans. Their voices were loud, but their attention was elsewhere. I served them quietly, my hands trembling as I filled their plates. They barely noticed. That didn't stop me. My love didn't depend on their awareness. As the night settled, I sat at the end of the table listening to their laughter. It didn't sound the same as before, more like noise than warmth. But I convinced myself that at least they were together, at least they came home. The tree glowed softly in the corner, the lights twinkling like old memories refusing to die. I watched them talk, their words sharp with success and pride. I tried to join in, but their conversations moved too fast, too far from me. I didn't fit in their world anymore, a world of screens, schedules, and selfishness. Yet, I smiled anyway, because love, for a mother, doesn't need a place at the table, it just needs a reason to keep hoping. As the clock struck 9, I noticed their eyes glancing at each other, impatient. I didn't know then what was coming, but I felt it, the same way one feels a storm before it hits. I looked at their faces, all 9 of them, and told myself silently that this was enough. Even if they left early, even if the laughter wasn't real, I had them here tonight. That was my Christmas wish, to be surrounded by my sons once more. The snow outside fell heavier now, coating the streets in white. I stood near the window for a moment, watching the flakes dance under the lamplight, and whispered a quiet thank you to life itself. I didn't know that in just a few hours that gratitude would turn into resolve, that this Christmas, the one that began with hope, would end with revelation. But that night, before the truth arrived, before the heartbreak took form, I stood there, heart full of faith, believing in the goodness of my children. I believed they still carried my love inside them. I believed this would be the Christmas they remembered what family truly meant. I didn't know it yet, but love, unbalanced and unreturned, was about to find its balance, not through anger, not through noise, but through a mother's quiet justice. The first knock on the door came in the late afternoon. I had just finished lighting the candles when the sound echoed through the hallway. My heart jumped, the kind of jump only a mother knows when her children come home. I wiped my hands quickly on my apron and hurried to the door. When I opened it, there stood my eldest son, tall and well-dressed, holding a gift bag that glittered with golden paper. For a brief moment, I felt that old warmth, the memory of him as a boy bringing me wildflowers from the garden. But this time his eyes were distant. His hug was brief, almost polite, the kind one gives out of habit, not affection. He walked past me talking on his phone, not noticing the lights or the smell of food I had spent hours preparing. His wife followed behind, nodding slightly, her eyes scanning the house as if she were visiting a museum, a place of old memories she no longer cared for. I told myself it was fine. They were just tired. It was Christmas. They'd soften as the night went on. Mothers always find reasons to forgive, even before a reason is given. One by one, my other sons arrived. Each time I heard footsteps, I smiled, thinking the next one would be different. Warmer, kinder, more like the boys I once knew. But they were all the same. Each walked in with gifts for each other, carrying laughter that didn't reach me. Their words filled the room, but none were meant for my ears. Their hugs were quick, their eyes restless. The house filled with movement, but not meaning. The living room glowed with the lights of the Christmas tree, yet it felt cold. The air carried no joy, only formality. They talked about their jobs, their vacations, their new cars, their business deals. Every word was about success, about money, about how far they had come. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Not one asked if I was lonely or if I needed anything. I stood among them like furniture, present but unnoticed. I served food quietly, one plate after another, the same way I had done for decades. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the dishes on the table, careful not to spill. They didn't notice. Their laughter rose above everything, sharp, hollow, and distant. They complimented each other's gifts, bragged about who had bought what, whose company had grown, whose children were studying abroad. The noise of pride drowned the silence of my heart. I sat down at the far end of the table watching them. They had grown into men with fine clothes, fancy watches, and expensive words, yet in that moment they felt smaller than ever. Their laughter no longer warmed the room, it chilled it. I forced a smile whenever one of them glanced at me, but inside I could feel something breaking. Not loudly, but slowly, like ice cracking beneath your feet. I remembered the years when Christmas was filled with chaos, when they were children running through the house, tearing open presents, singing songs with messy voices and asking for stories before bed. The house would echo with warmth then. My husband and I would sit by the fire, watching them and thinking, this is what love looks like. Those memories played in my mind now like a movie I could no longer touch. One of them mentioned that he had bought a new house in the city. Another bragged about his promotion. Another laughed about a new car. They compared wealth as if it were love. Every word made me realize how far they had drifted. Their success was loud, but their hearts were silent. When I tried to join the conversation, my words were brushed aside. They weren't unkind, just uninterested. That was worse. Cruelty cuts quickly and heals. Indifference kills. Slowly and never leaves. They were not cruel to me. They simply didn't care enough to be. I excused myself after a while and walked into the kitchen, pretending to fetch more food. But really, I just needed a moment alone. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. I could still hear their voices from the dining room. Laughter, clinking glasses, the sound of chairs moving. But none of it reached me. I had never felt so invisible in my own home. For years, I had imagined this night differently. I thought they would come home, bring warmth, share stories, maybe even stay the night. I thought we'd sing the old songs my husband loved. Instead, they treated it like an obligation, something to check off a list before moving on to something more exciting. I realized then that I had become a tradition, not a person, something they visited, not someone they loved. I walked back into the dining room, smiling again, pretending not to notice the change. Mothers are good at pretending. It's how we survive heartbreak. I poured them more tea, refilled their plates, nodded when they spoke, even laughed at their jokes. Inside, I was silent. My love had turned invisible, but it was still there, holding the moment together even when it didn't belong to me anymore. As the night went on, they began taking pictures, smiling, posing, capturing moments that looked happy but weren't. They stood near the tree, pretending closeness, their arms around each other, their eyes focused on the camera, not on one another. They posted those pictures online later. I'm sure, Christmas with family they would write, and the world would believe it. But only I knew the truth. The laughter was staged, the smiles were shallow, the warmth was gone. When I looked at them through the camera lens, I saw what years had done. They weren't my little boys anymore. They were grown men chasing things that didn't matter, forgetting the one thing that did, the bond that built them. I realized then that sometimes family isn't lost in death. It's lost in distance, pride, and greed. I told myself not to cry. I wanted to remember this night not for its pain, but for its lesson. So I smiled through it all, even as my chest ached. The food began to cool, the candles burned low, and the laughter slowly faded into soft chatter. At one point, I caught my reflection in the window. An old woman surrounded by her children, yet utterly alone. It was a strange image, one that felt both beautiful and tragic. I had spent my entire life giving to them, building their futures, protecting their dreams. And now, I was watching them from a distance, invisible, forgotten, yet still proud. That's what mothers do. We love, even when it hurts. The clock ticked toward 9. I noticed one of them looking at his watch, then another. They exchanged glances, silent signals only siblings understand. I didn't need to hear their words to know what was coming. They were planning to leave. I felt a lump in my throat but stayed quiet. I didn't want to ruin their night by asking them to stay. I told myself they had lives, families, responsibilities. That's how mothers forgive. We invent reasons to excuse the inexcusable, but deep down I knew the truth. The house that raised them, the hands that fed them, the love that carried them, none of it mattered anymore. Still, I held on to hope. I thought maybe they would notice. Maybe one of them would look at me and say, "Let's stay a little longer." But they didn't. They kept talking, checking their phones, finishing their drinks. The night grew colder, both outside and within these walls. I stood by the window again and watched the snow fall outside. The lights of the tree reflected on the glass, flickering like memories. For a brief second, I closed my eyes and wished that time could turn back, that my children could be small again, sitting on the floor, tearing open gifts with laughter. But wishes, like old women, fade when no one believes in them anymore. That Christmas night began with hope, the kind that makes you decorate, cook, and wait with trembling joy. But as I looked at my sons, my 9 grown men, sitting in the same room but living in different worlds, I realized something painful. Sometimes love grows old too. The warmth I waited for never came. The laughter I hoped for belonged to someone else. The Christmas I dreamed of existed only in my memory, and though I didn't know it yet, the same love that they took for granted that night would soon teach them the greatest lesson of their lives, that a mother's heart, once ignored, can turn into justice wrapped in quiet power. Dinner had ended, though I wished it hadn't. Not because it was joyful, but because I feared what would follow when it was over. There's a kind of silence that enters a home when love starts leaving, and that night I could feel it long before the door opened. My sons had eaten, laughed among themselves, and exchanged gifts, but never once looked at me the way sons should look at a mother on Christmas night. I could feel the warmth fading minute by minute, replaced by the faint chill of formality. The plates were still full on the table, half-touched food going cold while they gathered near the doorway, coats in hand. I heard one of them say he had other plans. The words cut sharper than they should have. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the tone, casual and careless, as if the night had been an obligation finally fulfilled. Another son checked his phone, typing a message, smiling at something on the screen that had nothing to do with me or this house. The youngest one looked at his watch, shifting impatiently. "We should go," one murmured, and the others nodded in quiet agreement. Just like that, it was decided. Christmas night was over for them, but for me it had only just begun. I watched as they put on their coats, their expensive scarves, their shiny shoes. I remembered when I used to buy those shoes for them as children, when I would save small coins to make sure they had new clothes every winter. I remembered how I'd tell them, "Don't forget your gloves," as they ran out the door to play in the snow. Now they didn't even look back to see if I was watching them leave. I tried to smile, to hide the ache that was growing in my chest. My voice came out small as I thanked them for coming. One of them nodded without meeting my eyes. Another mumbled something about visiting again. Soon. I had heard that word before. Soon. It always meant never. They walked to the door together, chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened. Their laughter filled the hallway, but it wasn't the laughter of family. It was sharp, hollow, and distant, the sound of people already thinking about where they'd rather be. When the last door shut behind them, the sound echoed through the house like a final note of betrayal. The click of the lock felt heavier than it ever had. I stood there, still holding my apron, staring at the door that had closed, not just on the night, but on years of love, years of giving, years of motherhood. I turned slowly and looked at the living room. The Christmas tree was still glowing, the lights blinking cheerfully, as if mocking the emptiness that now surrounded it. The plates sat untouched. The candles had burned low, their flames trembling, dying out. There was no sound except the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint whistle of the winter wind against the window. The chairs were still warm from where they had sat, but the air already felt cold. I walked back to the table and sat down in the chair at the end, the same place I had always sat when my husband was alive, when this room was full of life and noise and love. My hands trembled as I reached for one of the plates, still half full of food. The sight of it made my throat tighten. I thought of how I had stayed up late the night before, cooking their favorite dishes, folding napkins, the way my husband used to like, lighting candles to make everything perfect. I had imagined laughter, warmth, and stories. Instead, I had received silence, indifference, and departure. I looked at the gifts I had prepared for them. Small boxes wrapped with care, each with a note and a piece of my heart. None of them had even opened theirs. They had taken them without looking, putting them in their bags like afterthoughts. I had given them memories, and they had given me absence. The house was quiet now, painfully quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, heavy, hollow. I tried to tell myself not to cry, but the tears came anyway. They fell without sound, landing softly on my hands as if even they didn't want to disturb the silence. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, snow was falling gently, covering the world in white. The streets were empty, the sky glowing faintly from the reflection of lights. I could see faint footprints where my sons had walked out to their cars. The snow was already beginning to erase them. Soon there would be no sign they had ever been there. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and whispered to myself that maybe next year would be different. Maybe next Christmas, they would remember what love felt like. Maybe they would remember who built the life they now took for granted, but deep inside, I knew they wouldn't. You can't miss what you no longer value. I turned back to the room and looked around. Every corner carried a memory. The couch where my youngest once fell asleep waiting for Santa, the spot near the fireplace where my husband used to sit reading the newspaper, the dining table that had once held laughter instead of leftovers. Now, all that remained was me and silence. As the night deepened, I sat near the tree and stared at the flickering lights. They blinked in rhythm, almost like breathing, as if the house itself were alive and grieving with me. I thought about how love changes, how it starts as fire, bright and consuming, and then turns into smoke, fading, leaving behind only the smell of what once was. For the first time in my life, I felt something inside me go still. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was realization, a quiet understanding that something had ended that night. The family I had built, the love I had carried, the loyalty I had believed in, it had all vanished quietly without ceremony. It struck me that they hadn't left me because they hated me. That would have been easier to accept. No, they left because they didn't care enough to stay. Indifference hurts more than cruelty because at least cruelty means you mattered once. The clock ticked toward midnight. I sat on the couch, wrapped in my old shawl, staring at the empty room. The shadows from the tree lights danced on the walls, moving softly like ghosts of the past. I remembered my husband's laughter, my children's tiny hands, the smell of cookies baking in the oven, the sound of wrapping paper tearing. All of it felt like another life. I had spent decades giving everything I had, my energy, my health, my time, to build a world for them, and now that world stood empty. They had inherited my sacrifices, but not my values. They had my money, my property, my blessings, but they had lost my heart. When the last candle went out, I whispered a small prayer. Not for them, but for myself. I prayed for strength, not forgiveness. I prayed for courage, not comfort. I prayed that someday I would find peace again, not through them, but beyond them. That night, the silence felt final. I realized that I had been waiting for something that no longer existed. The family I once knew had turned into strangers wearing familiar faces, but beneath the sadness, something else began to stir. Something quiet but powerful. It wasn't revenge yet, not even resolve. It was awareness, the first spark of truth that would, in time, become justice. As I sat there under the dim glow of the Christmas lights, I made myself a silent promise. I would never beg for love again. I would never wait at a door that no one planned to open. I had given them everything, and now I would take back what was mine, not in anger, but in clarity. The night they left me was the night I found myself again. When the last echo of their laughter faded, the silence became its own sound. It filled the house, crawling into every corner, louder than any noise I had ever known. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, and the occasional creak of the floorboards as if the house itself was sighing. Everything that had been full an hour ago, the table, the chairs, the air, now felt hollow. I walked back to the dining table where plates of half-eaten food sat untouched, the candles burning down to their stubs. The smell of roasted chicken, pudding, minning, and spices still lingered. But it no longer smelled like celebration. It smelled like waste. The waste of effort, of hope, of love that went unnoticed. I picked up one of the plates and stared at it. The food I had cooked with trembling hands and a hopeful heart was now cold, uneaten, forgotten. It mirrored what I felt inside. The chair at the head of the table, where my husband used to sit, was empty, just as it had been for years. But tonight, that emptiness felt heavier. The space beside me, where one of my sons used to sit and rest his head on my shoulder, was empty too. I ran my fingers gently across the fabric of the tablecloth, tracing the gold embroidery that had faded over time. It had survived decades of washing and wear. It had seen joy, laughter, arguments, and reunions, and now it bore witness to something else: abandonment. I tried to distract myself by clearing the dishes, but every movement hurt. The clinking of plates against the sink sounded like broken memories. I washed them slowly, one by one, as tears mixed with the warm water running over my hands. I didn't sob. I couldn't. The sadness was too deep for tears. It sat in my chest like a stone, unmoving and cold. When the last dish was done, I turned off the lights in the dining room and walked into the living room. The Christmas tree still glowed softly in the corner, its colors flickering in the dimness. The gifts I had wrapped for my son sat untouched beneath it. Each one had their names written in my shaky handwriting. To Mark, with love. To John, Merry Christmas. To Daniel, from Mom. I had imagined their faces lighting up when they opened them. Now I knew they never would. I sat down on the couch and looked around the room. Every decoration I had placed, every candle, every garland, every ornament had been chosen with care. I wanted them to feel welcome, to feel warmth. But none of it mattered. You can't decorate your way back into someone's heart. Outside, snow continued to fall in slow, graceful flakes. I could see it gathering on the window ledge, soft and pure, untouched. It reminded me of when my sons were little, when they used to run outside, catching snowflakes on their tongues, laughing until their cheeks turned red. I smiled faintly at the memory, but it hurt more than it healed. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and closed my eyes. In the silence, I began to hear echoes, laughter from years long gone, the sound of tiny feet running across the floor, my husband's deep voice singing along to an old Christmas song. It felt like ghosts of happiness had returned to keep me company. I whispered a small thank you to them, because even memories felt kinder than the present. Hours passed, though time didn't feel real anymore. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, each second marking another moment. I sat alone. I thought about calling one of them, maybe just to hear their voices, maybe to say goodnight. But I stopped myself. If they wanted to talk, they would have stayed. I had to accept that I no longer held a place in their lives the way I used to. I stood up and walked toward the window again. The snow had covered the roads completely now. The lights from the nearby houses glowed softly through the frost. I could see silhouettes of other families, shadows moving, laughter spilling faintly through the walls, the warmth of connection glowing from inside. I imagined mothers surrounded by children, hands holding, hearts full. And then there was me, standing alone in the dark, watching a world that had moved on without me. A part of me wanted to be angry. Another part just felt tired. I realized then that sadness is not always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet ache, like frost slowly forming on glass, invisible at first, but spreading until everything is covered. I wasn't angry at them for leaving. I was angry at myself for expecting them to stay. I sat back down on the couch, the ticking clock keeping me company. I thought about the years I had spent raising them, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the dreams I had for each one. I remembered how I used to tell them that love was the most valuable thing in the world. Now, they valued everything except love. They measured life in wealth, not warmth. At that moment, something inside me began to change. The pain didn't go away, but it started to harden into something else. Resolve. A quiet kind of strength began to grow in the spaces where love had once lived. I realized that I had given them everything. My time, my energy, my savings, my trust. And they had taken it all without gratitude. Maybe it was time I stopped giving. The thought scared me at first. I had never thought of myself before them. For 70 years, my life had revolved around their needs, their happiness, their success. I had been the backbone of their beginnings, and yet they had treated me as if I were a chapter they had already read and forgotten. But that night, as the snow fell heavier and the wind whispered through the cracks of the window, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never spend another Christmas waiting for people who didn't care if I was alone. I looked at the empty chairs one last time, the flickering tree lights reflecting in my tears. The loneliness didn't crush me anymore. It clarified me. For the first time, I saw everything for what it was, not for what I wished it could be. My sons were grown men who had chosen their comfort over their conscience, and I was a mother who had chosen hope over reality for far too long. I blew out the candles one by one until only the tree remained glowing. The soft lights blinked slowly like the fading heartbeat of a memory. I whispered to the room, to my husband, to the ghosts of our past, that I understood now. I didn't belong to them anymore. I belonged to myself. I went to bed that night with tears still drying on my cheeks, but my heart strangely steady. The bed felt too big, the sheets too cold, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I didn't dream that night. My heart was too tired for dreams. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the world outside was bright and white. The snow had stopped falling, the sky was soft blue, calm and open. I sat up slowly and looked around the quiet room. It was the same house, but something inside me had changed. The sadness was still there, but now it had purpose. It was no longer just pain. It was a seed of power, buried deep, waiting for its time to grow. I didn't know it then, but that lonely Christmas night, the one where I was left behind, would become the night that turned everything around. When morning arrived, the world outside was quiet and white. Snow covered everything, the roof, the streets, even the old bench in the yard where my husband used to sit. For a long moment, I just watched it through the window. The sky was pale, the kind of soft color that comes after a storm. It felt peaceful, almost sacred. Inside, the house was cold, but my mind was still, calmer than it had been in years. The night before had changed something inside me. I didn't wake up crying. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal as sharply. What I felt instead was a kind of stillness, the silence that comes after you've stopped hoping for things that will never come. It wasn't emptiness, it was awareness. I made myself tea and sat by the window. The same chair, the same view, the same house. But I was different now. For the first time, I saw everything clearly, as if a fog had lifted. I looked at the family photos on the wall, weddings, birthdays, newborn babies. In each picture, I saw my face smiling. I used to believe those smiles were real, that those moments meant something lasting. Now, I could see the truth behind them. I wasn't smiling because I was happy. I was smiling because I was trying to hold everyone together. I had spent decades building a family that had forgotten how to love. I gave them everything I had: money, advice, care, forgiveness, until I had nothing left for myself. I taught them that I would always be there, no matter how they treated me, and that was my mistake. I didn't raise them to be cruel, but I raised them to believe I'd never stop giving. That morning, I realized the difference between love and loyalty. Love gives. Loyalty remembers. I had given them both, and they had given me nothing in return. The house was filled with reminders of my giving. The expensive furniture they had convinced me to buy for family gatherings. The big television one of them had picked out so everyone could watch together. Even the kitchen appliances were chosen to make things easier when they visited, but they rarely did. Every object I owned was tied to them in some way, but not one of them was tied to me anymore. I sipped my tea slowly, the steam warming my face. I thought about the years I had spent sacrificing, working long hours, saving every coin, skipping meals, saying yes even when I was tired. I did it all with love, believing it would come back to me. But love that is taken and never returned eventually becomes resentment. As the sun rose higher, the snow began to sparkle. I remembered each of their faces from last night, smiling, distracted, uninterested. They hadn't even noticed how tired I looked, how my hands shook when I served them. They hadn't looked into my eyes once. It wasn't their fault entirely. I had made it too easy. I had built their comfort at the cost of my own. That morning, I asked myself a question I had never asked before. What did I have left for myself? The answer was simple: nothing. No money that was truly mine, no peace that wasn't interrupted by guilt, no joy that didn't depend on their presence. My life had become a waiting room, waiting for calls, for visits, for love that never arrived. I looked at my reflection in the window. The woman staring back was old, yes, but her eyes were sharp again. There was no bitterness in them, only truth. I realized that I wasn't weak for loving too much. I was strong for surviving it. And now I wanted to live the rest of my days not as someone's forgotten mother, but as my own person. The house was mine, legally, emotionally, and spiritually. I had paid for it. I had built it with my husband, brick by brick, room by room. The deeds, the accounts, the papers, all of it still bore my name. They thought it was theirs now, that I would just let go quietly, hand over everything like I always did. But they were wrong. The same woman who had built this family could also unbuild it. I stood up and went to the drawer where I kept all my important papers. They were neatly organized, just as my husband had taught me. Property documents, bank statements, wills, receipts, bonds. As I looked through them, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Every paper was a reminder of something I had worked for, something I had earned. For the first time, I didn't feel like these things belonged to the family. They belonged to me. I sat down at the table and began to read through the documents carefully. My husband had always said, "Never let anyone else handle what you worked for." I had forgotten that lesson. Now it echoed in my mind like a warning that came too late, or maybe just in time. Each paper I touched seemed to speak to me, reminding me of the years I had spent protecting what we built, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was restoration of balance, of dignity, of justice. They had taken so much from me because I let them. I had taught them how to take. Now I would teach them what it feels like to lose. I made a list that morning, not of people, but of lessons. Lesson 1, love should never be blind. Lesson 2, silence is not peace. Lesson 3, forgiveness is not weakness. Lesson 4, a mother's heart may break, but her mind can still act. As I wrote each one down, I felt lighter. The burden I had carried, the guilt, the disappointment, the loneliness, began to lift. For the first time in years, I felt control returning to me. I folded the list neatly and placed it under the documents. Then I opened my phone and searched for the number of my lawyer, the same one who had helped my husband years ago. His office was closed for the holidays, but that didn't matter. I would wait until the next morning. The plan had already begun, not out of anger, but out of quiet determination. As the hours passed, the sunlight moved across the floor, golden and soft. I walked through each room of my house, the kitchen, the hallway, the bedrooms, touching the walls, remembering the life that had once filled them. I spoke softly to my husband's picture on the wall. I told him I finally understood. Love is sacred, but it must also be respected. If it is not, it becomes a chain. That day, I promised myself I would never be chained again. When evening came, I made myself dinner, just a small bowl of soup and bread. The quiet no longer hurt. It felt honest. I realized that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. Loneliness comes from waiting for people who do not care. Solitude is peace earned by letting go. The night outside was still cold, but inside I felt warmth, the warmth of purpose. I didn't know exactly how everything would unfold, but I knew one thing with certainty. My sons would learn what I had learned that Christmas night, that a mother's silence can speak louder than her words, and her justice can arrive quietly, wrapped in grace. Before I went to bed, I wrote one more thing in my notebook. Tomorrow, I begin again. That sentence was simple, but it changed everything. Because clarity is not a moment of peace. It's the beginning of power. The next morning began like any other, calm, gray and still. But inside me, something had changed forever. The woman who had once waited by the window for her sons had vanished overnight. What remained was someone new, quiet, composed, and resolute. I was no longer going to be the giver of endless chances. I was going to be the keeper of balance. I started the day by opening the old wooden box in my cupboard. It was where I had kept every important thing: my late husband's will, property papers, old letters, and a few photographs from our younger days. The papers smelled faintly of dust and time, and as I sifted through them, I realized how many of my life's decisions had been signed away in the name of love. Every signature I had placed, every document I had trusted them with, had been an act of affection, not logic. But love, when taken for granted, becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. I laid the papers out on the table one by one: title deeds, joint accounts, bonds, business shares. Each page was proof that everything they had, the houses, the land, the comfort, existed because I once believed in giving more than I should. My husband and I had built everything from nothing. We started with a small piece of land, 2 pairs of hands, and the kind of love that made hard work feel like worship. Over the years, we grew it into something big, a legacy, not just for us, but for our children. But they didn't see legacy. They saw inheritance. That morning, as I ran my hands across the papers, I whispered to myself, enough. The time for silent endurance was over. This time, silence would be my weapon, not my weakness. I made myself a cup of black tea and began planning. There was no anger in me, only precision. I knew how they thought. They believed I was too old, too soft, too dependent to make decisions without them. That belief would be their mistake. I dressed simply. A clean sari, warm shawl, and the pair of shoes I rarely wore. I tied my hair neatly and looked in the mirror. For years, I had seen an aging woman, fragile, forgotten, fading. But that morning, I saw my reflection differently. My face had lines, yes, but they were not weakness. They were maps, proof that I had lived, fought, endured, and survived. I took my documents, placed them carefully in a folder, and stepped outside. The cold air bit against my skin, but it felt refreshing, like a baptism into a new version of myself. The walk to the lawyer's office was long, but I didn't feel the weight of the distance. Every step felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me piece by piece over the years. When I arrived, the receptionist looked surprised to see me. "You came without an appointment?" she asked gently. I smiled. "I've been waiting long enough," I said. Inside, my lawyer, an old family acquaintance, greeted me with warmth. He remembered the times when my husband and I used to visit together, but when he saw the look in my eyes, he understood this was not a social visit. I explained everything: the neglect, the betrayal, the years of silence. I told him that I no longer wished to live in the shadow of my own sacrifices. He listened carefully, his expression soft but serious. When I finished, I handed him the folder. "I want every property, every account, every asset that bears my name or partial claim to be reviewed," I said quietly, "and if legally possible, I want them back in full." He nodded. "You understand what this means?" I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. "It means I finally understand my worth." We spent hours going through every document. Some of the properties were still under my control, though my sons had been managing them. Others were registered jointly, but the major authority, the power of decision, still rested with me. They never cared enough to notice. They thought paperwork was for the old. They forgot the old woman was still the one who signed their future into existence. By the afternoon, everything was in motion. Transfers, cancellations, new registrations. The machine of justice began to turn, powered not by rage but by reason. My lawyer assured me that by the end of the week I would have full control again. I walked home slowly, the winter sun glinting weakly through the clouds. I didn't smile, but my heart felt light. For the first time in decades, I wasn't walking toward the past. I was walking toward my freedom. Back home, I brewed another cup of tea and sat by the window. The snow had started to melt, leaving small patches of grass peeking through. It reminded me of myself, buried under years of neglect, but still alive underneath. That night, I didn't wait for calls. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder if they were thinking about me. I knew they weren't, and that no longer hurt. They were living their lives, secure in the illusion that their world was unshakable. What they didn't know was that the foundation of that world, every key, every paper, every ownership, still rested in the hands they had ignored. The next day, I visited the bank. The manager, who had known me for years, greeted me kindly. I asked to review my accounts, the joint ones especially. I looked over every transaction, every deposit, every withdrawal. There it was, all the evidence of their dependency disguised as success. They had used my funds to build their comforts, using my trust as their ladder. I requested to change the authorizations, sign new documents, and transfer balances where needed. My hands didn't tremble once. By noon, it was done, quietly, legally, completely. No confrontation, no arguments, no warnings. When I returned home, the house felt different. The walls that had once echoed with neglect now felt like they were listening, witnessing my transformation. I walked to the living room, looked at the family photos, and whispered softly, "This home remembers who built it." Days passed, and everything was silent. My sons didn't notice at first. Why would they? They were too busy living their lives. But change was already rippling through the surface. Their businesses began facing small interruptions. Accounts paused, transactions flagged for review. Their properties showed pending notices for ownership confirmation. They assumed it was clerical error. It wasn't. It was clarity returning home. One of them called me midweek, his tone impatient. "Mom, did you sign some new paperwork? There's some issue with the property registration." I replied gently, "Yes, dear, I did." He paused, caught off guard by my calmness. "Why?" he asked. "Because," I said, "I decided it was time to clean up old mistakes." He didn't know what to say, and I didn't explain further. I hung up the phone and smiled faintly, not in satisfaction, but in peace. For the first time in years, I was in control, not of them, but of myself. I had spent decades believing that being a mother meant giving endlessly, but I finally understood that sometimes being a mother also means teaching. And this silence, this careful undoing, was the lesson they had earned. The following morning, I received confirmation from my lawyer. All ownerships had been transferred, all deeds re-registered, and all accounts secured under my sole authority. It was done. The homes they lived in, the money they used, the comfort they boasted, all of it now rested in my hands again. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt restored. I stood by the window as the sun rose over the snow-covered roofs. The light spilled into my house, soft and golden. It touched the old photos on the wall, the empty table, the chair where I sat, and for the first time, I didn't see loneliness in the silence. I saw strength, because my silence had finally spoken, and it was louder than any apology I would ever receive. The morning it all unfolded was unusually bright. The sky was pale blue, and the air outside carried a stillness that only comes after a storm. I remember sitting at my table with a cup of tea, watching sunlight fall across the floorboards. Everything looked the same, yet I knew the world had shifted. Somewhere, my sons were about to wake up to a reality they never imagined. A world where their comfort, their control, their pride had vanished overnight. It began with the smallest ripple. A bank alert here, a message there. I didn't need to see their faces to know what was happening. I could picture it clearly. The confusion, the disbelief, the sudden panic. They would check again and again, refreshing their banking apps, calling their managers, asking what went wrong, but nothing was wrong. Everything was finally right. The first call came mid-morning. My eldest son. His voice carried a tremor I hadn't heard since he was a child. "Mom," he said, trying to sound calm. "There's something wrong with the accounts. Everything's showing empty. Did you do something?" I didn't answer right away. I let silence stretch, heavy and intentional. Then I said quietly, "Yes." The word hung there, sharp and final. He stammered, searching for a response, but none came. I didn't need to explain. Every transfer, every signature, every form had been perfectly legal. The same mother they had ignored, dismissed, and spoken over had always been the foundation of their fortune. And now she had simply removed her name from their comfort. Across the city, my other sons were experiencing the same unraveling. Some discovered that their property deeds no longer bore their names. Others found sale notices already in process. A few realized that the joint accounts they had depended on were now locked, inaccessible without my approval. Their luxury had vanished as quietly as they had walked out on me that Christmas night. The phones started ringing one after another. My home, once silent, now buzzed with desperation. I didn't answer all the calls. I didn't need to. The message was clear. They were finally learning the weight of their mother's absence. In every transaction, I had left a signature, not of anger, but of justice. For years, they had taken everything I gave as a guarantee. They thought my love was infinite, my patience unending. But now, they were facing what happens when even the gentlest heart decides it's time to stop bleeding. By noon, my lawyer called to confirm all sales and transfers had been executed smoothly, every asset was liquidated, every title reassigned, every document finalized. The homes they lived in, the ones they had decorated, claimed, and called their own, were no longer theirs. The accounts they flaunted had been drained, not through theft, but through rightful ownership. The empire they thought they built was never theirs to begin with. I thanked him softly and hung up. Then I walked through the house, my house, and looked at everything with fresh eyes. It wasn't just brick and walls anymore, it was freedom. Every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture, every window felt different now. For the first time in decades, I wasn't living in guilt, I was living in truth. As I stood near the window, I saw snow melting on the roof of the car outside. It glistened in the sun, like glass. I thought of my sons, scattered across their fine houses, staring at their empty screens, their empty wallets, their empty hearts. It wasn't revenge that filled me. It was balance. The world had simply returned to its rightful order. In the afternoon, one of them came to my door. His car pulled up fast, tires crunching on the gravel. I saw him through the window. His expensive coat, his face red from anger or maybe shame. He pounded on the door, calling my name. I didn't move at first. Then, slowly, I walked over and opened it just enough to see his eyes. He looked at me the way a man looks when his world collapses. Confused, desperate, afraid. "Mom, please," he said. "You can't do this." I looked at him calmly. Can I? He didn't answer. His lips trembled. His confidence, the same arrogance that had filled his voice when he once dismissed me, was gone. What stood before me wasn't a proud man anymore. It was a boy who had finally realized how fragile pride can be. He tried to argue, but his words stumbled. I didn't need to shout. My silence was stronger than any speech. He looked over my shoulder into the house he had once called his. I saw the recognition in his eyes. He was standing outside of something he used to own, begging to be let in. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months ago, I had stood on the other side of that same door, waiting for love that never came. Now, the door belonged to me again, and so did the power to choose. He left eventually, his steps heavy, his shoulders slumped. I watched his car pull away and felt no satisfaction, no hatred, just peace, because for the first time he had felt what I had felt, the sting of being unseen, unheard, and unwanted. Only now he would remember it. As evening came, the phone calls slowed, the desperation had turned to silence, the same silence they had once left me in, but this silence was different. It was mine. It was earned. I made myself dinner. Simple soup and bread. The taste felt honest. I sat near the fire, the warmth spreading through the room, and thought about everything that had happened. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't cursed, I hadn't wished them harm. I had simply shown them that even the quietest woman in the room holds the power to end what she began. People think revenge is loud, that it comes with shouting, chaos, and destruction. But the truest revenge is quiet. It doesn't break things, it reclaims them. That night, as I prepared for bed, I stood by the mirror and studied my face. There were lines of age, yes, but also lines of courage, the kind carved by years of patience finally rewarded. I realized then that I had not lost my family that Christmas. I had simply discovered who they truly were. Before I turned off the lights, I walked to the window one last time. The snow had stopped. The moon hung low, soft and silver, lighting up the road where my son had driven away. I whispered a small prayer, not for them to suffer, but for them to understand, because understanding is the greatest punishment. It lingers longer than pain, and it changes people in ways no shouting ever could. I went to bed with the softest heart I'd had in years. The house, once full of noise, now felt like a sanctuary. I closed my eyes, knowing I had done what needed to be done, not for vengeance, but for peace. And as I drifted to sleep, I realized that the real reversal wasn't the money or the property. It was me. For decades, I had been a mother waiting to be loved. Now, I was a woman who had finally learned to love herself enough to stop waiting. The next morning, the news spread among them about the transfers, the sales, the missing wealth. There was anger, denial, disbelief. Some blamed me, some blamed each other. They argued, accused, cried, but none of it mattered. The papers were signed, the ownerships changed, and the truth was permanent. They had left me alone on Christmas night. Now they were the ones left outside, cold, bewildered, and humbled. And as they tried to rebuild what they thought was theirs, I finally built something I had never owned before, my peace. In the days that followed, silence became the language that spoke the loudest. My phone, once a quiet object resting untouched on the table, now vibrated endlessly. Messages, missed calls, voicemails, each one carried the same tone, disbelief wrapped in panic. I didn't rush to answer. I had spent years chasing their attention. Now they were the ones chasing mine. At first, the calls were filled with confusion. They couldn't understand what had happened. They thought there was a mistake, a glitch, something that could be fixed with a few angry words or a lawyer's signature. But when they realized it was all legal, all deliberate, all final, the tone changed. Panic turned into desperation, desperation into regret, and regret into shame. I didn't need to see their faces to know how it felt. I had felt that same sting when they left me alone on Christmas night, the feeling of being abandoned by those you thought would always stand beside you. Now, they were learning that lesson, not through cruelty, but through consequence. One by one, they came to me. Some called ahead, others arrived without warning, standing at my doorstep with lowered eyes. It was strange to see men who once looked so sure of themselves now standing like lost boys, hands clasped, words trembling. They didn't speak right away, they didn't know how. For years, I had been the one filling the silence, smoothing the rough edge of conversation, forgiving before apologies were even spoken. But now, the silence was mine to keep, and they had to sit inside it. The first one to speak was my eldest. He looked older than before, not in years, but in spirit. His arrogance had fallen away, leaving only confusion and guilt. "Mom," he whispered. Why did you do this? I looked at him for a long time before replying. Because, I said softly, I finally remembered who built all of this. He lowered his eyes. The others behind him stayed quiet, watching, waiting for me to forgive like I always did, but forgiveness wasn't mine to give anymore. Forgiveness, when given too freely, becomes permission, and I was done granting permission to my own pain. They tried to explain themselves, to justify their actions. We were busy. We didn't mean to. We thought you were fine. Excuses layered upon excuses, each one thinner than the last. I had heard them all before. They didn't realize that neglect has no language. It speaks in absence. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply listened, letting them face the echo of their own words. For years, I had filled their silences with love. Now they had to fill mine with truth. As they spoke, I watched them carefully, not as a mother, but as a woman who had finally stepped outside her own story to see it clearly. They were my sons, yes, but they were also men shaped by comfort, by entitlement, by a love they never had to earn. They had grown so used to my giving that they forgot it was a choice, not an obligation. When they finished talking, I looked at each of them and said quietly, "You left me alone on Christmas night." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. They looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I saw tears in one of their faces, not the kind that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes from recognition. They finally understood that what I had taken from them wasn't money or property. It was certainty, the illusion that I would always be there, no matter how they treated me. One of them, the one who had always been the most dismissive, spoke softly. "We didn't think you'd ever do something like this." "I didn't think you'd ever forget I was your mother," I replied. The silence after that was long and sharp. They stayed for a while longer, sitting awkwardly in the living room they once filled with noise. Their eyes wandered over the walls, the furniture, the photos, everything that still belonged to me. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that I had always been the backbone of everything they claimed as theirs, and now, without me, all of it had crumbled. After they left, I stood at the window watching their cars drive away, slowly, silently, almost respectfully. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something deeper, closure. It wasn't joy that filled me. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when a wound finally stops bleeding, even if it leaves a scar. Over the next week, the noise faded. The calls became fewer, the messages stopped, the silence returned. But this time it was not empty. It was mine. I no longer waited for the phone to ring. I no longer looked out the window hoping for visitors. I had learned to fill my own life again, not with people, but with purpose. I spent my mornings in the garden watching the frost melt off the leaves. I read old books, cooked for myself, and wrote letters I would never send. I realized that I had spent my whole life being a mother, but I had forgotten how to be a person. Now, I was learning again. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I found a picture of my sons when they were children. 9 little boys around a Christmas tree, eyes wide with wonder. I ran my fingers over their faces, and for a moment, I felt that old ache again, the love that had built everything, the love that had never truly left me. But this time it didn't hurt. Love doesn't disappear when it's not returned. It simply changes shape. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the loneliness, the decision, the reversal. And for the first time, I didn't see it as revenge. I saw it as revelation. My sons had not been born unkind. They had become that way because I allowed them to. I had shielded them from hardship, and in doing so, I had robbed them of gratitude. I had mistaken giving for love and silence for peace. It took being left alone on Christmas for me to understand that unconditional love should never mean unconditional suffering. I didn't hate them. I never could. A mother's love doesn't vanish. But I finally loved myself enough to stop letting that love be a weapon used against me. As the firelight flickered across the room, I realized something simple yet profound. Respect and love are not the same. You can love someone and still walk away. You can forgive someone and still set boundaries. You can lose everything and still come out whole. The next day I wrote in my notebook, "They left me to feel small. I taught them what it means to lose big." I didn't write it out of pride. I wrote it as a reminder that the power I had was never in my wealth or my property. It was in my ability to endure, to think, to act, and to let go. Weeks later, I received a letter from one of my sons, handwritten, not typed. It was simple, short, and real. He wrote that he finally understood, that Christmas night had been his greatest shame. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he asked for a second chance. I didn't reply right away. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip, it's a bridge you rebuild slowly. But I smiled when I read his words. Maybe, just maybe, something had changed. Not because I punished them, but because I finally respected myself enough to stop being their cushion. That realization was my freedom. For years, I had believed that family meant forever, that blood was a bond that couldn't be broken. But I learned that sometimes blood isn't thicker than self-respect. Sometimes love isn't about holding on, it's about letting go with grace. The world saw an old woman who lost everything. But I knew the truth. I hadn't lost a thing. I had gained myself. And in that quiet, I found the one thing I had been searching for all along: peace. The days that followed were quiet, not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the kind that feels like healing. My house, once a space of noise and forgotten love, now breathed differently. The air felt lighter, the walls softer. It was as if the home itself had been waiting for this, for me to take back my power, to reclaim the peace I had been denied for years. I woke up each morning without fear of being disappointed, without the weight of waiting for a call that would never come. The first sound I heard was the chirping of birds outside my window, a small, gentle reminder that life goes on no matter who leaves or stays. I would make myself tea, open the curtains, and let the light in. It felt new, though the sun had always risen the same way. I just hadn't been present to notice it before. Peace, I realized, doesn't come when everything is fixed. It comes when you stop needing it to be. For years, I had defined my happiness by others, by whether my sons visited, whether they remembered my birthday, whether they said I love you. I had built my peace around their approval. Now, I found peace in small things, in the sound of boiling water, in the way light danced across the floor, in the slow rhythm of my own breath. I no longer cared about who thought I was right or wrong. Justice had already spoken, not through punishment, but through balance. The same sons who once looked down on me now understood what it meant to lose what they never valued. They had spent years believing they were above me. But life, in its quiet wisdom, had shown them that even the hands that build can take apart. Some evenings, I would sit by the fire and think about forgiveness. People often think forgiveness is about letting others off the hook. It isn't. Forgiveness, I learned, is about letting yourself rest. It's about saying, this hurt happened. It cannot be undone, but I will not carry it forever. I didn't forgive them to make them feel better. I forgave them so I could sleep at night. There were moments when memories tried to creep in, Christmases from long ago, birthdays filled with laughter, the sound of tiny feet running down the hallway. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They felt like chapters from another life, a different book that had ended long ago. I didn't resent those years. I just knew they were gone. Sometimes I wondered if my husband would have approved of what I did. He was a man of patience, quiet strength, and deep fairness. He believed in teaching lessons with love. I smiled when I thought of him. I believed he would have understood, because what I did wasn't driven by hate. It was driven by love. Love for myself, love for the truth, love for the dignity we had both worked so hard to build. One afternoon, I took a walk to the nearby park. It had snowed lightly the night before, and the ground sparkled under the winter sun. I watched children playing, laughing as they threw snowballs. Their joy was simple, pure, untouched by pride or greed. For a moment, I closed my eyes and remembered my own boys at that age, innocent, uncorrupted by ambition. I felt tears welling up, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of acceptance, because I finally understood that love doesn't vanish when people change. It simply returns home, back to the one who gave it. I went to the church that day and lit a candle. I didn't pray for revenge or for my sons to come back. I prayed for understanding, that they might one day realize that wealth means nothing if it costs your soul. I prayed that they would find humility even if it came late, and most of all, I prayed for peace. Not for them, but for myself. When I came back home, the house felt alive again. The warmth of the fire, the faint smell of tea leaves, the quiet hum of life, it was enough. I no longer needed noise or company to feel complete. I had learned to keep my own heart company. Weeks passed and the world outside changed. The snow melted, the air grew softer, and spring approached. With it came renewal, not just in nature, but in me. I began tending to the small garden behind the house. My fingers, once stiff with age, began to remember the old rhythm of planting, watering, nurturing. Every sprout that rose from the earth reminded me that endings are not always tragic. Sometimes they're just the soil, preparing for new growth. One morning, as I was watering the plants, I saw a small envelope slipped under my door. The handwriting was familiar, one of my son's. Inside was a short letter. He wrote that he missed me, that he finally understood what family really meant, that he had sold his car, moved into a smaller apartment, and wanted to visit when I was ready. I sat down with the letter in my hands for a long time. My heart didn't race like it once would have. I didn't cry. I simply smiled. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. But it no longer mattered. I had already forgiven him in silence long before he wrote. I placed the letter inside my old Bible and whispered, "Peace comes when you stop needing closure." That afternoon I made soup, baked bread, and ate at the table alone. Not in sadness, but in contentment. The house was quiet, but it no longer echoed. It breathed. I realized then that I didn't need anyone to fill it. I was enough. Sometimes I would hear their voices in my dreams, laughing, calling my name, asking for food. I would wake up, smiling, not aching, because I had made peace with the truth. I had loved them enough to let them learn on their own, even if it meant losing them for a time. As months passed, people in the neighborhood began to notice the change in me. I walked taller, I smiled more. I wasn't the fragile old woman who waited by the window anymore. I was calm, steady, whole. I realized that true peace isn't given, it's built, one decision at a time. Every moment I chose dignity over despair, self-respect over fear, stillness over begging. That was a brick in the house of my peace. There were days when loneliness still came softly, like an old visitor, but it didn't stay long. I would pour myself tea, look outside at the trees, and remind myself, I am safe, I am free, I am enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the window and thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the revenge, the realization. And it struck me, I hadn't punished my sons, I had awakened them. Sometimes the greatest love a mother can show is the love that refuses to enable. I closed my eyes and smiled. The fire crackled softly. My heart was quiet. I didn't need anything else. Because in the end, peace is not something you find, it's something you create when you finally decide you deserve it. And I did. Now, as I sit here, older, calmer, softer, I tell my story not with anger, but with clarity. Time has a way of washing away the noise, leaving only the truth behind. And the truth is this. I am no longer the woman who waited by doors that never opened, who begged for love that was mine by right. I am the woman who learned that heartbreak can be a teacher and solitude can be salvation. When I look back on everything, it feels like a lifetime condensed into a single lesson. That love, when given blindly, can destroy you, but love, when given wisely, can set you free. I often walk through the garden in the early morning when the world is quiet and the air still carries the cool breath of night. The flowers bloom without audience. The birds sing without applause, and the sky brightens without permission. Nature doesn't beg to be seen. It simply exists in its own truth. And that, I realized, is how I must live. There was a time when I thought family was everything, that blood alone defined belonging. But I've learned that family isn't made of shared names. It's made of shared hearts. And when hearts grow cold, blood becomes only a reminder of what once was. My sons were my world, but I had forgotten that I, too, was part of that world. I had built them, nurtured them, lifted them, and in doing so, I had erased myself. The day I took everything back, I didn't just reclaim money or property. I reclaimed me, my dignity, my power, my peace. I didn't destroy their lives. I reminded them who gave them life. Sometimes love must roar in silence, not to hurt, but to wake. Now, when I see my reflection, I no longer see wrinkles of sorrow. I see maps of wisdom. Every line on my face tells a story, not of pain, but of persistence. I see the woman who endured the sting of betrayal, the burn of loneliness, and the cold of neglect, and still stood. I see the woman who chose silence, not because she was weak, but because she knew silence. When used right, becomes a mirror, one that forces others to see themselves. There are moments when I think of that Christmas night, the flickering lights, the untouched food, the sound of the door closing. For years, I thought of it as the night I lost everything. Now, I know it was the night I began again. I sometimes wonder what my sons think of me now, whether they hate me, resent me, or finally understand. But the truth is, it doesn't matter anymore. Understanding isn't a gift I need from them. I have already given it to myself. I live quietly now in a house filled with sunlight and calm. I cook small meals, read old books, tend to my flowers, and write letters I never planned to send. Some might say I'm alone, but that's not true. Loneliness is what you feel when you are disconnected from yourself. I'm more connected now than I have ever been. I learned that peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives like morning light, gently, steadily, until everything is clear again. Sometimes neighbors stop by to visit. They ask about my sons, about the story that has quietly spread through the town, how a mother turned her sorrow into justice. I always smile. I don't speak ill of my children. I simply say they're learning. Because that's the truth. They are. A few of them have written to me since. Letters filled with apology, guilt, questions. Some I've answered. Some I've left unanswered. Forgiveness doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it's in the way you move forward without bitterness. Do I miss them? In small ways, yes. I miss their laughter before it changed, the sound of their footsteps when they were boys, the smell of their hair when they fell asleep beside me. But I don't miss the way they made me feel invisible. I don't miss being in a room full of my own blood and feeling like a stranger. I have learned that love without respect is poison. It fills you for a while, but it kills you slowly. And I refuse to die before my time. Some evenings, I sit by the fire and talk softly to my husband's photograph. I tell him everything. How the boys grew, how I stood my ground, how I finally did what he always told me I could. I imagine him smiling, proud, not because I fought back, but because I found myself again. My story isn't about revenge, it's about resurrection. The resurrection of a woman who gave too much for too long and finally decided to give something to herself. When people hear my story, they often say, "You were brave." But bravery isn't what carried me. What carried me was truth. The simple, unshakable truth that love without boundaries becomes servitude, and servitude without appreciation becomes suffering. Now, I live by one promise: never to shrink for anyone again, never to make myself small so others can feel big, never to give all of me to people who offer nothing in return. I find joy in small things now: the crackle of firewood, the smell of rain, the taste of fresh bread. My joy is quiet, but it's real. And after a lifetime of noise, quiet joy is the most beautiful kind. Sometimes when the wind blows through the garden, I imagine it carries the voices of my sons, laughter from their childhood, echoes of the days when love was pure. I smile when I hear it, because even though life changed, the love that created them will always live inside me, not as longing, but as memory. I've come to understand that some stories don't need happy endings. They need honest ones. And mine is exactly that: honest, earned, free. The woman who is left alone on Christmas night now lives every day like a gift. She eats when she's hungry, sleeps when she's tired, and speaks only when she has something worth saying. She doesn't beg for love. She doesn't wait by doors. She doesn't cry for what's gone, because peace is not about who stays. It's about who you become when everyone leaves. When I close my eyes at night, I feel my husband's presence beside me, the warmth of my own courage surrounding me, and the stillness of a life finally lived on my own terms. And in that silence, I whisper to myself, "They left me once, but I found myself forever." And that is enough.